My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sangarat, Guru Piran, fellow Jnanis. Today I continue the Mahan's chapter 17 on life. It is a very interesting observation that is made by Subra that what we call the word cloud here has a lot of things about life. And I must admit that this was put up right after one of my early morning meditation. And these were the words that came out in my mind on what life was about. About family, enlightenment, mindfulness, energy, entity. We have, different entities, get up and oomph and, livelihood and a whole range of things. And one would have thought that life has both the sukhas and the dukkha's, and they seem to be mostly about life, positive or, existence, and there's no negativity in there. This is by accident, or maybe, it was a moment where, the word cloud was reflecting back what was on my mind in terms of what life was. And I thought it was a very good observation that Subramanian, where is all the negativity? And I myself say, hey, all the things that came out as positive, you see. Perhaps it's something that you want to do an exercise on, just sit for a moment, and write down what are all the things that life means to you, right? And if you take a kind of a percentage of how many of it is sukha, how many of it is blissful, how many of it is dukkha, or how many of it is just, neither sukha or dukkha. And you take a kind of a percentage of that and you see that maybe what's reflecting in your mind is the state of your life, right? So it's something that you may want to do, more regularly, particularly as you become more and more intensive in your spiritual pursuit. It is good to say, what are the words that come that reflect what life is about for you? And for me, it looks like oomph and, paranjoti and meditation and zest. And of course, there's a few words that are very interesting. So, but you see that the words that magnify a lot is like things like compass, enlightenment. Perhaps that's what's reflecting, and maybe reading a lot, being among people in that circle, the mind starts reflecting that. So perhaps it's something that maybe all of us should be doing on a regular basis. So here in this chapter, Swamiji talks about life, what life is about, and he talks about both the sukha, dukkhas, and how to manage this. And in the last two classes, I talked about life, and I think the last class I spoke about the different models of, explaining this complexity, the multifacet of life, using kind of a simple models to explain. And sometimes nature is the best way to teach us of what life is all about, and observing nature. And one of the things that we see is that a lot of things that we learn from nature, we adapt from nature. Nature is part and parcel of us. And becoming more enlightened and illumined helps us to understand the forces of nature and forces that is embedded within the universe and within all of us. And I want to speak about the spiritual compass. And it's a model that describes an integral part of who we are and how it has an impact on life. I've touched on this several times, but I think this time I want to go a little bit more detail. I was supposed to cover the chariot model today, but I realized that a chariot without a compass could go in a direction that you don't want to go. So what I'm going to talk about is the compass in a little bit more detail. But I want to talk about actually what the compass actually does. So, and I think all of us know what a compass is. And as I said, we have to learn from nature, given that nature is core to our own being. And there are many things that is parallel to what's happening in the things around us. And I was fortunate that, my father was a surveyor and he uses compass a lot, and compass meant a lot to him. And one of the presents that he gave me was a compass. And he says, this compass has got very important meaning. If you learn to master this compass, you'd master the direction of your life. And I didn't understand at that time what he was trying to say. And I think over time, I think it became more and more clearer that the external compass that he has given and my gurus have given, the teachings and so on, actually is embedded to unlock the spiritual compass in us and in the disciples. So let's look at what the compass does. The compass actually gives us direction. It points us to a position or a direction. But more importantly, the compass actually tells us, where you go, or, wherever you go, you need a reference to place, to the place you are getting. I mean, where you are and where you want to go, it gives you a kind of a direction. So you see navigators use this, people that are traveling use this, pilots use this. So without the compass, we see that, it's sometimes very difficult to travel to a particular destination. But what that means is that how to get there means we need to know how to use the compass really well. And if you don't know how to read a compass, then it is pointless of having a compass because, you're directionless. So mastering the use of that compass is very critical. And one of the aspects of the compass is that what to do when we are deviated from our path. So when we are away from our path, the compass actually shows us how to get back, provided we know the coordinates that where we want to go and the coordinates where we are and the displacement in the coordinates that where we are located at the present and where we want to head off. So the compass gives us a good direction, provided we know how to use the compass very well. And there's a whole science behind that compass. It's about push and pull forces. It's about the forces of electromagnetism that, enables, you got the North Pole, South Pole. So that magnetism within the Earth enables the compass to give direction where the North Pole is. And that's what navigators use. That's what explorers use. That's what pilots use. So that there is a physics behind this phenomena. So parallel to this physical compass that gives us direction, everything in this universe has somewhat a compass. And we too have a compass, because otherwise you'd not see, galaxies in orbit, planets in orbit, and so on. So I want to focus today on our own spiritual compass. There is a parallel to this. And we see that this spiritual compass, so how do we relate this physical compass or, to our spiritual compass? And this is what this topic is about. So we see that in the physical compass, it points to the direction, but in the spiritual compass, what does it show? It shows you to the path of enlightened living. That means, life could be turbulent, life could be challenging, life could be, various things, sugas and dukkha. But this spiritual compass guides you to this path of, cool, calm, a sense of peace and harmony, and gives you that enlightened living. So embedded within us, there is a spiritual compass. And what is that spiritual compass? And we'll see. Where to, so it tells you, so wherever we want to go, it gives you a reference to where we are and where we're going to go. And it tells you how far you are from the distance of where you are now and where you want to get. In that same way, from a spiritual compass perspective, we know where we are in that spiritual development and where we want to go. And it tells you the kind of thoughts that we have, the thoughts we should have, the kind of speech that we, speak about, and the things that we need to, the kind of harmonious speech that we should have, and current speech and the harmonious speech. In the same way, thoughts, speech, and our actions where we are now and where we ought to be. And the spiritual compass enables you to reflect back the distance between these two points. And similarly, but to know that, we need to really understand how to discover and how to use this spiritual compass. And this is where you see great saints and sages teach us that actually the spiritual compass, you need to know how to use this compass, but it helps you to discover it and use it effectively to attain that enlightened living. And that spiritual compass is embedded in by many masters, in many scriptures, in religious scriptures, in spiritual work. I'll talk about both the Dvaita and Advaita philosophies, also in scientific, pursuits, the search for truth, the search for, what we see and what is real and what is illusion, what is biased outlook and what is unbiased outlook. And not only scientific approach, but there is also another important way that enables us to discover this compass that is anchored on both religious, spiritual, scientific, and rational and logical thought. So again, we see that, how to get there, how to discover one's own spiritual compass requires us to really understand the various wisdom, knowledge, scriptures, and so on. And this is where the great saints and sages start showing us how we, discover this important substratum in us that gives us direction, gives us, a sense of peace and calm, and transition from our current state of existence to a more harmonious living. Now, it also tells us this, when we discover this, we see that the compass, whenever we deviate from our path, it gives us direction back, how to get there. In the same way, sometimes we know that, our thinking is not harmonious. Our thinking is not, divine, and we know. And the compass reminds you, hey, there is a difference between what you're thinking now and the thought processes now and the speech and your actions compared to what the idealized, thought processes and speech and so on. And it helps you to transition. It helps you to moderate and modulate your thought processes and so on, so that it becomes more harmonious. So whenever you deviate, it reminds you, there's a recalibration that takes place. And it's interesting that, sometimes people say, I said something, I should not have said it, and what that's reminding is that our own conscience, or, but sometimes, we know it is there, but we don't know how to utilize it or master it, or we regret. And great saints and sages teaches us how to actually master this inner compass or inner resources in us. What is the science behind this? We know, magnetic, our normal compass, push and pull forces, electromagnetism. In that same way, our own spiritual compass is also impacted by the push and pull forces. This is the sukha dukkha, the cause and effect, and interestingly, I'll come back to a question later on, that what happens to our normal compass when we are in the North Pole. As long as we are far away from the poles, it'll tell you this is North Pole and this is South Pole. But when you are in the North Pole, what happens? Or when you're in the South Pole, what happens? In that same way, the spiritual compass operates that as long as our thought processes are, there's a gap between our thought processes now and the idealized thought processes are harmonious, universal, and peaceful, it'll show you this is the direction. But what happens if we attain that? What happens if our mind becomes divine and pristine and universal? What would the direction of that compass be? And what would the experience be? And I'll come back to that experience because that's the last experiment and example I'm going to show you. So we see that there is that force that impacts the compass. In that same way, there are internal forces, the mind forces that has an impact on our inner spiritual compass. So the question then is that how to master your spiritual compass? How do we master this? How do we first discover this, and how do we learn to master this? And this is where the teachings of the great saints and sages, religious teaching, spiritual teaching, scientific reasoning, the thought, the whole pursuit of unbiased perspective of things, search for truth, a rational and a logical approach to understanding the true realities of life. And there are many approaches, you'll see later on when I speak about, but how do we have is there a unified approach that brings both the religious, spiritual, scientific, and the logical reasoning? So is there a general theorem that we can discover that helps us discover our own spiritual compass? And this is what this satsang will go through. So you have seen a spiritual compass, and this is the spiritual compass I put down. So you see that on the bottom, you have God. This is a religious pursuit of discovering God, through bhakti, discipline, through rituals, some aspects of both acharas and vicharas. And you see that, all religious pursuit, whether Hinduism, Christianity, and many of the other religions, have, rituals to help people, attain that grace of God and the sublimity and the discipline to enable the mind to become more harmonious, more virtuous, and so on. We also have, the self-realization pursuit, the pursuit of not an external search for God, but an internal search for God, an experiential search for God. So again, I'll speak about that. But they are both anchored on two important components. One is a kind of a scientific approach, based on evidence and empirical evidence and experience. The other one is rational pursuit based on reason and logic. So you see in many of those discussions, in the religious discussions, there have been various debates by many scholars within Hinduism. Those who are very interested should look at the works of Ramanujacharya and Madhvacharya. And the same thing in Christian theology. There are various debates on what God realization is, and in many other religious pursuits. Those discussions are very rich, and it uncovers, various important constructs of God, and how God is separate from the human consciousness and the convergence that takes place. In that same way, we see that a lot of debates in the context of discovering consciousness, self. Is this God? Is this the true reality? Again, it's through experiential learning. So there are various practices of yoga and meditation and so on to discover this true reality. But in all of them, if you see, the deep debate is the transition from the rituals, the acharas, to vichara. And there's a lot of deep, the scholars, in this, both, the pursuit. And there are two different schools of thought. So the one that is bhakti related, Dvaita, where what we call the dualism school of thought, where they see God and human separate, and the whole objective is to through bhakti one attains the grace of God, and there's a sense of convergence that takes place. The Advaita school of thought, the non-dual school of thought, believe that God and human consciousness are one. And these discussions you will see in the YouTube clip, from 21 to 23, there's 25, the discussions between Advaita and Dvaita. I encourage all of you to look at that. But what we see here is that through these debates and discussions, it's about exploring, and discovering what the true reality is. And they're anchored on, empirical evidence, anchored on reason and logic. When I mean empirical evidence, as what we see scientists use microscope and telescope to discover the microbes, the most minute things, electron microscope, And the same thing we see that, they use telescope to look at the lights, the light and the stars and the galaxies, the macrocosm, through telescope, and the microcosm through telescope and microscope. We see that the great saints and sages have discovered this inner scope, that process of scientific, experimental, experiential approach to that dwelling deep to discover that God, God substratum, or sometimes they call it consciousness or the self. So we see that this pursuit of that true reality, in both schools of thought, you see this. So here in the Dvaita school of thought, you see God and I are separate. But my goal in life is to attain the grace of God, and over time that discipline and the bhakti leads to the grace of God. Grace of God leads to greater bhakti and greater deepening of my understanding of God, ultimately attaining that God realization. So there's an evolution that takes place. So in the same way, we see that the Advaita takes a different approach. God and I are one. God manifests as my consciousness. So to everything else is unreal. The only reality is this consciousness state, this self state. And various approaches and methods have been, designed and developed to enable the mind to be absorbed in this state of consciousness of the self, or the universal, what Mahan calls the universal peace sanctuary. So we see that a lot of Mahan's teachings are also leaning towards the Advaita teachings of that, consciousness, God realization, and self-realization. So whatever the different schools of thought, as I mentioned, there is a very intensive scientific kind of approach of, examining everything with great scrutiny, and, what is real. And you see in many of the Upanishads and many of the scriptures, they say, this is not real, and this is not real. If you can show something is, an experience, that is also not real, because it's material. When you say something we cognize, what are we cognizing with? And this pursuit goes on. Ultimately, we see that, both schools of thought, the sense of convergence that takes place of what the true reality is by, slowly separating out, this is not real, and ultimately what the reality is. So you see that, attaining the state of nothingness, the state of absence of matter and energy, leads to that state of supra matter and supra energy, which is what we call the spiritual self. So we see that pursuit in this intensive debate and discussions that is really, really exciting. And when one pursues this, have that understanding and that deepening through meditation and self-realization, one experience that the mind goes through that experience. And somehow the mind, when it's absorbed in it, it starts getting a more universal lens in terms of seeing the world, cognizing things around it. So this is the spiritual compass that many of the great saints and sages have been talking about, the inner direction that we get. So that's as one masters that, as one masters the mind and the thought processes and why certain thoughts are there, how the thoughts are generated, and how one, observes the thought, and how one quietens the thought, and ultimately how one realizes that I am nothing but that which creates everything. As what Swamiji says in the book, the I God book, he says that the seeking, still seeking, the seeker finds himself as the God. So through this, discovery of that spiritual lens, the spiritual compass, through this intensive introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, that gives you a good understanding of both the scriptures, good understanding of, what the scriptures are, saying about God, nature, and the self. And through intensive meditation, the mind's DNA slowly starts changing. Ultimately, the mind realizes that it is that. So this is the way how great saints and sages teaches us about that compass and how to utilize that compass. After discovering the compass, how do you use it to navigate your life? How do we use this compass to divinize every facet of our lives? You know, we've discovered the compass, but we've got to be engaging in this material world. We can't run away from the material world. You know, we have to engage in the material world, but how do we engage it with a more divinized mindset? So this is why Mahans and other great saints say that using this universal lens or compass, how do we divinize every experience, every thought, and every moment of our lives? Now, similar to a navigator who knows how to use this compass, you see that even how challenging the terrain is, how challenging the oceans are, the direction is not lost because the compass gives you the direction. Even how much turbulence you are in, the waves to turn your vessel around, but you can still, the compass still gives you the direction back on how to get back onto the path. In that same way, no matter how much turbulence we are in, if we hold on to that compass, when things settle down, we will not be disoriented. We'll be able to regroup back and say, look, okay, this is the direction that we need to take. So this is what great saints and sages teaches us, and this spiritual compass is an example. Why this is really important is that if we see the compass is critical in helping us enhance our quality of life. When we enhance our quality of life, we see that our mind becomes more calm, cool. In that sublimity of the mind becomes more creative, more innovative, and more inspirational. And I spoke about the different stages of life, as we saw in the previous satsangs, we have 12 stages of life. And I've mapped the 12 stages of life, from birth of the body right up to the dissolution or death of the body. And we see that evolution, all of us in that process go through various experiences. And those experiences gives us, both the sukha and the dukkhas in our life that shapes our life. So we see that for an ordinary person, we see that, life could be quite turbulent. And we see that in the early phase, from infanthood to early childhood, yes, we've got significant growth, there's vitality, our quality of life improves, we understand the world better. But as we go through adolescence, we see that, hormones start playing, and we see that, you're neither a child nor you're an adult, and children that age go through various turbulence, that you see that, various turbulence that they go through. And then, as one progresses, life becomes a little bit more steady, provided if you acquire the necessary skill sets, education, profession, family life, and the sense of maturing. And you see that life sometimes can be comfortable, but for many, it may not be if you don't have the right skill sets. And we see that most ordinary human beings go through this turbulence. And what's really interesting is that as they mature and in the late adulthood, where the body is starting to age, we see that all the disease and disorders come and people worry, and and suddenly you see that things take a turn for the worse. And you ask most people are worried about disease, people are worried about death. The last 2-3 years, people are very worried about COVID. So life can be quite turbulent, and you see that most of them may not have time to think about spirituality, far less discover the spiritual compass in them. And sometimes they leave it too late, right? They say, well, I'll get into spirituality when I have more time, after retirement. By then, the body and the mind is unable to do that intensive introspection, contemplation, reflection. So this is a common phenomena that we see, and the curve, the volatility may be more intensive for some than the others. So we see this is an ordinary person's life cycle. So part of that life cycle is due to the samsaric lifestyles that, the sukha dukkhas that come in our lives. And there are moments we have exuberance, really feel excellent, There are moments that it comes down for, various reasons. So again, most human beings ride this cycle. But if we are able to acquire the knowledge of the spiritual compass early on, right? And if that family values build in about the values, spiritual values, the religious values, and extracting that to build a mind that is very resilient, a mind that is strong, a mind that is can-do attitude, a mind that says, God is with you, God is imprinted in you. What more do you need? You can overcome all the challenges. So the mind is so strong that it is not like a porcelain where it looks hard on the surface, but when you drop it, it shatters. But the mind that is truly inspired by that spiritual compass, that knowledge of the great Mahans and the saints and the sages, with an explorer mind, a scientific mind to discover the truth. And you see that that mind will be like a rubber ball. You throw it against the wall for a short while, you have a compression, then it bounces back, right? So we see that, that knowledge of that spiritual compass, the discovery of the spiritual compass is really important. And we see that, when one discovers the spiritual compass, the life trajectory is very different. Even how difficult the circumstances, they know how to ride it. What was a scar becomes a star. What is impossible becomes I'm possible. And all the challenges in life becomes a foundation for new learning. Yes, there are dips and there are, movement upwards, but they are not too volatile. But what's really interesting is that the trajectory is on upward. And we see that that spiritual compass helps navigate, helps moderate and modulate when things, are challenging. Okay, how do we transform them into wisdom, knowledge, and knowledge for us to develop further and improve ourselves? So we see this in great saints and sages. We see this in ordinary people. If you see the lives of Sri Rama and the lives of other great personalities that have adopted the spiritual compass, from various religions and various cultures and different times, and you see that even how difficult challenges that they experience, it becomes a foundation for their learning. Life becomes very harmonious in spite of the challenging environment, but they become inspirational to themselves, to the family and others. And you see that their life cycle and the quality of life continuously improves. So that experiential learning, becomes an important part of their life, where they're continuously learning new things. And the knowledge of the scriptures, the knowledge of the Mahans and the great saints becomes a fuel for the enlightening process. So we see this. And what's really interesting is that if you take an ordinary person's life and an inspirational person's life, you see that the gap between the two is what we call the value created from living a spiritual life, right? Yes, even the spiritual person would go through disease, but, the level of ability to accept it and ability to still keep the mind strong in spite of the body starting to gracefully decline, but the mind keeps it healthy. And you see that in that process, the decline is reduced significantly, and they continue to inspire others. And I'm always amazed by great people who have difficulties or have disease or have bodies that are deformed or amputated, but yet the spirit is still permeating and enlightening people. And one classic example is I think people should read the story of Ashtavakra, who's got 8 bends in his body, and how he became a great saint. The body may be bended, the mind is not bended. So again, we see that the difference between an ordinary life that is just going with the life cycle, riding the sukha and dukkha without the knowledge, compared to those who have the knowledge. And you see that the value is that the difference between the blue curve and the red curve, that's the value that you create for yourself and the people around you, and you leave back that knowledge, for others to pick up. So you see that, I'm always inspired by great saints and sages of their lives, and particularly, people who have gone through very challenging circumstances, but are able to transcend that, and they leave those lessons for many of us, and are very inspirational. So we see that, what we think, who we adopt as models, mentors, we see that that's what gets imprinted in us. So this is, so they live a life of, what, we have these Purushatras, which is Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Having a dharmic mind, a mind that is resilient, strong, powerful, able to withstand everything. And that comes from that spiritual knowledge and discovery of the spiritual compass. And that mind is able to generate Artha, wealth, the 10 capitals, which I'll speak about in the next satsang, So this dharmic mind that generates the wealth of knowledge, wealth, material wealth, and all the other wealth. And karma is that the ability to divinize all our desires, right? Fulfill all our aspirations in life in a divine way. And that leads to moksha, which is an enlightened life. So we see that it doesn't say that you have to give up desires. It's saying that you have to divinize the desires and become transcendental to those desires. When people try to give it up without proper understanding, you see that the mind still goes back, gravitate to those desires. But when we divinize it, we become transcendental to it. So we see that, that value that we create is very much tied to that spiritual compass that we'll discover, learn to use it effectively, and become a master of it to unlock the master within us. So before I leave, I just want you to think about this question. So we have a spiritual compass and we have a normal compass. What is the direction of the compass on the North Pole or the South Pole? For you to think about this. And similarly, as long as we are away from the North Pole or South Pole, the compass will tell us the direction of the North Pole and South Pole. Okay, so we see this direction of North Pole and South Pole. And there's a nice YouTube clip that actually shows that, when scientists actually were traveling to the North Pole, and they were asked, look, what do you experience? And it says that actually, there's a YouTube clip there that you should look at. It actually tells us that, hey, the magnetic compass, as we go around or get to closer to the North Pole, it does weird things. It's all over in different directions and randomly. And they say to stabilize this, because that could put the aircraft or the explorer in a difficult position. To stabilize that, they actually get good direction. What they do is that, they use something called the GPS, Global Positioning System, right? And for me, so it helps them to overcome the challenges of the magnetic compass. And interestingly, that magnetic compass, so the compass is all over, and there's a very spiritual meaning to this. But to anchor that, to understand that, one needs to truly understand how the mechanism of that compass is. And we see that, for me, that mechanism of the compass is actually what we call the Jnana Ulal Paranjati system. That means that spiritual compass that, when we truly understand that when we get to the state where, the no thing state, which is the nothingness state, we see that universality is permeated in everything that we observe. As what we see in the magnetic compass, it's in all directions. The universality is in every direction, every facet of our lives. And sometimes, for some people, it could be quite startling, but good understanding of this will give us a good perspective of life in a more universal way and how to manage this. And this is what we're going to speak about. I'm going to speak about in the next class on how do we master the spiritual compass. particularly the GPS system that is embedded in all of us that gives us direction in a more precise way. And that is anchored on the knowledge of the scriptures and the knowledge of Mahans, and also the logical reasoning and the scientific approach. So next class, we're going to do a little bit more in-depth analysis of the spiritual compass so that we are able to, have a much more inspirational and harmonious life. So look out for the next class that we're going to go more in depth in this. Sandosham, thank you.